When we think about obituaries here, we want to think of them as news articles. Okay? Okay. So, even though we're not focusing on the details of the person's death when we're writing the classmate's obituary, we are focusing on what is most interesting about that person, or even newsworthy about that person, to share at the beginning of the article. So just like with other news articles or even features, we want to think about the 5 W's and the 1 H. Okay. Now again, that's not necessarily about how they died, because that might be a separate news article. There was an accident on the interstate, this person was killed, investigation's ongoing, how did it happen, et cetera, et cetera. We're not focusing so much on that. We're focusing on what made this particular person interesting. You see on page 96, information that's essential. Okay, name. We usually like to use at least the middle initial, because if it's kind of a common name, older people, they will scour the newspaper every day for obituaries to see if friends they know died, relatives, or hopefully they would know before they got the newspaper, but people they went to school with, and you may have a grandparent who does that, or a great-grandparent, right? Find a phrase for your lead that best summarizes who this person was or what she did. Now, this is going to be one of the hardest parts, just like with that first article you did, coming up with a lead, strong lead. You're not just simply saying the person died. You're not just simply saying the person died. You have to come up with something that sums up the person in one sentence. Tricky. It's tricky. John Jones, a prominent local dentist, or Jane Jones, author of 29 crime novels. Okay, of course you can elaborate later, but you have to have some kind of identifier. Very, very important that you have an identifier right in that sentence. And these are probably going to be immediate identification leads. You're going to put the person's name usually, not always, but usually in the first sentence. Age. You usually do include the age because, again, that helps differentiate the person. If there's another person who has the same name, that will help loved ones be able to tell them apart. Oh, that isn't the John Smith I know, that's some other John Smith. Now, this is very interesting. The middle of the page on the bottom, obit style, watch your language. It's kind of sad that we have to be concerned with these things, but for address in particular I'm looking at, they used to give the full address. That was the typical way you would do an obituary, but now people are concerned that burglars or conmen, swindlers might see that and then try to move in to basically profit off that person's death. No problems. Similar sort of thing. Would you go into that the person was very promiscuous, or they had been jailed before, or they were a shoplifter? Well, probably not. If it's a feature that's celebrating them, or maybe it's a story about overcoming, and they had already talked publicly about their personal demons and how they'd overcome that. Well, then that one might be all right. It depends on sort of how past it is, how personal is it, how private was it. Okay, flowery phrases, we're going to come back to that. Flowery phrases, euphemisms. But in this case, we're talking about terms that you use instead of the word that the person died, instead of death or died. We usually avoid euphemisms, but in a minute I'm going to show you some obituaries, and you're going to see they use them. The person went to dwell in the heavenlies. The person is now passed on. That's a polite way of putting things, but that is not a news reporter's way of talking, right? You just say that the person died. You don't need to use the euphemism, but you see it in the newspaper, and the reason is because a lot of these obituaries that we'll see were written by family members. Okay? So this is kind of a tough thing, or even the deceased himself or herself might have written this before they died. They know they're going to die, they want to write they're going to write their own obit, maybe. Right, so that's okay if the newspaper allows it. You do see euphemisms being used. But you as a reporter, that's a big no-no, okay? So we're going to look at euphemisms, some examples here, some actual examples. So avoid funeral home cliches. Don't speculate about the deceased's celestial activities. That's an interesting way to put it. I personally believe in life after death. I'm a believer. a Christian, so I do believe that there is life after death. But I'm not going to bring that into my newspaper writing of obituaries, okay? Or maybe they're in the other place. I don't know. Who am I to say? You can't see that. You can't report on that. So don't go there, basically. Okay. People die unexpectedly, not suddenly. Do you see that at the bottom of the page? It's a good one. Good thing to point out. All deaths are sudden. So the moment of death itself is sudden, even if they had a lingering illness. But if they, died in an unexpected way, like a car accident, then it would be unexpected, not suddenly. If you start to say I was a result of surgery, I guess you start to think about Joan Rivers, for instance. And then they did find it was because of surgery, right? At the time. Yeah, you won't know right away, and there's usually an investigation. In that case, it was. If the journalist starts to declare that, it's because of the surgery, well, you see how that could lead to some libel, well, that's not true, so therefore we're going to sue the newspaper. You just don't want to pronounce judgments until it's all sorted out. So even a turn of a phrase can really get you in trouble. It's a good question. Okay, so let's look at 3 types of obituaries. The 3 types of obituaries. Okay, now they give you 2 types here. They call this one on the top of the page of 97 a standard obituary, standard news obituary. Okay, and I'm going to refer to this as a biographical or formula obituary. This is the type you're going to be writing about your classmates. Okay. So this is, just like it sounds, this is a news article about a person celebrating their life, but usually in a way that is sort of formulaic. It sort of sounds like the other obituaries in that same newspaper. Okay? It's written, for our purposes, here they kind of go into that this is a well-known person. You want to talk about their significance. But for our purposes, usually it's kind of a regular person. It's not a celebrity. If so, it's on a very local level, regional importance. Okay, so the president of a bank dies. Well, that's important, but just for the region, that person might not be in the news every day, right? You might not know that person by name, but they have some importance, right? So they're influential, but they're not necessarily prominent. Okay, this type of obituary is often written by the newspaper staff, but at smaller papers, it might be a family member. In fact, that's probably more common than not. And so that's when you start to see things like the person went to dwell in the heavenlies or with the angels, because that that a family member wrote that. Okay, sometimes it's even written by the funeral director, funeral home. Okay, but I'd say that's more common. They do that another type, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay, these might actually be paid obituaries. They might have to pay to put it in the newspaper. Especially big cities. Euphemisms, avoid if you're the reporter, but they're common if you're the family member. Okay. Now, remember that we even use euphemisms for things like, the person passed away. The person departed, the dearly departed. These are not euphemisms you want to use as a reporter, even though you would think that why not? You just say the person died. We don't need to dress it up. Or the person succumbed. We don't need that. Succumb to the illness. We don't need those euphemisms, even those are more common. Okay, so remember that you need to confirm your facts always. If you have a list of facts, on your funeral director's page, bear in mind those might be incorrect. So you need to call people, you need to go to records, if you have access to public records, and you should, you really need to double check everything and triple check everything, because it can look really bad if mistakes pass into print. Okay, another important thing with a standard obituary is you really want to have anecdotes. those little stories about the person. And as you, hopefully you're getting to interview family members, they will tell you little memories they have. Oh, remember the time that Aunt Nancy, she decided to plant a garden and she didn't have a green thumb and everything died in the garden, but she was excited because one plant lived and it turned out to be a weed. Remember that? Oh, yeah, I remember that. That would be a good anecdote. Okay, another thing, quotes. Do you include quotes in an obituary? Maybe. Maybe. Ideally, yes. Right, but it depends partly on if it's a very formulaic structure that you always use at your newspaper, and do you have time to get quotes, people's memories, even quotes from the deceased, meaning from previous articles usually. Okay, or she said, or kind of a hearsay type quote. Okay, another type of obituary, I'm going to erase this and write over it, would be a death notice. Okay, and this is barely an obituary. It's very, very short, and it gives the basic information. It's usually just announcing that the person died and that more information is coming in. They'll give you more information later about the funeral arrangements, or the regular standard obituary has already been written, and now they're releasing the funeral information, which might be the same day. Okay, so this might be one paragraph, okay? It's very short. It might be handled by the advertising department of the newspaper. So you as a reporter might not have anything to do with this type of obituary. It's usually organized by the funeral home, and that they have a little formula that they fill out. They give the information to the advertising department. It's usually the arrangements, the person's name. It might be their age, might be another identifying thing, and then it's the arrangements. When, where to send flowers, when the funeral is, or memorial service, what time, okay. And then the home, the name of the home. Okay, and then finally the third one is the notable person or feature obituary. And by notable person, we mean really notable person. Okay, so celebrities who've died, a president, ex-president who died. So we definitely want quotes in this, usually recorded from somewhere else. This is sort of like the final word on the person, so it usually is very celebratory. And there's usually a certain tone to these stories. New York Times does this type of obituary really, really well. Okay, yes, very short. That should tip you off right away, right, with how short that is. Gives you the person's age. Question?
Is the passed away a euphemism, or is it okay?
That's definitely a euphemism.
It is or no?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
No, that might mean that somebody else has written this other than a reporter.
Okay.
Okay, good question.
Death notice? It could have been a family member.
Well, it would probably be the funeral home, and they're used to using euphemisms, believe me, over there.
Okay.
Okay, now look at this. They say a complete obituary will be held in a future edition. All right, so this person, they died Friday. They don't have any information about, but they do have a place that you could send condolences. All right, now this is a longer one. Okay, do we see anything here that's a no-no? Yeah, so that's landed on pretty thick. But again, who could blame them? It's a family member probably writing this, so you understand that. Okay, they're capitalizing things you normally wouldn't in AP style. Now, the newspaper's usually really strapped for staff and time to do it. So they're not going to, they're just probably, things are just going to pass into type. And that passed into type there. So, moving on. So, what kind of obituary was this, by the way, then? Yes. So this would be the standard or formula obituary. And it's different lengths. If you want to see more of a feature type obituary, then you'll have to either go to New York Times, which they have people who just do obituaries, and they research, and you can actually win a Pulitzer for doing obituaries.